Today in the EU defense budget dilemma. Facing pressure from the Russian aggression in the east, the EU has pledged to build an independent, cross-border military under an ambitious defense strategy. Now, the plan would require 500 billion over the next decade, according to what Commissioner von der Leyen has said in the past. However, so far, only 1.5 billion has been currently budgeted for the next 3 years. As the European Commission looks to boost defense spending, it must answer critical questions. First of all, who will fund it? And then, how much will it cost? Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Giada Santana, and this is Today in the EU. Today, I'm joined in the studio by Aurelie Pugnet, our defense editor here at Euractiv.
Hi, Giada.
Aurelie, we're here to talk about the price of EU defense, but nobody really seems to agree on a number. We know for a fact that the budget will increase, but by how much are experts saying it will increase?
Indeed, we don't really know, actually. So there is this strategy, this overarching strategy that the Commission has presented and that is currently under discussion with the member states, and then will also have to be under discussion with the Parliament to further motivate the industry and the member states to collaborate on procurement, on production, and to motivate them into scaling up and making, we say, the continent's defense industry war ready. The problem is that we don't know how much it costs. The Commission proposed a very modest budget, which is 1.5 billion, which may sound like a lot, but when we're talking about reindustrializing, basically, the defense industry here in Europe, it's not that much.
That's also something that transpired from my conversation with MEP Nathalie Loiseau. She's the former chair of the Defense and Security Committee.
We know for sure that in the last MFF, the money allocated for the European Defence Fund was disappointing in terms of amount. If we are serious about defense, we have to put more money from the budget in it.
It's created a few debates because the Commission has said, well, we need more, we need to find more money, how do we do it? Do we take joint borrowing? Do we increase national contributions from the member states without putting a price on it? Von der Leyen, the Commission president, said a couple of months ago that her estimate was 500 billion for 10 years. There hasn't been any official communication about that number, so it's still a bit difficult to pinpoint exactly what it would do and how exactly it would come into place and really where that would come from.
So the issue of funding goes along with the issue of cooperation across border between different European defense industries. How is the EU planning on increasing that communication across borders?
So the EU so far has set up a few programs over the years to support the member states or the industries in doing more research, doing more development together. So cross-border development and cross-border research, also cross-border production. We've talked a lot about ammunition production last year. And so EU funds or European-wide funding is seen as an incentive in making the industries and the governments work together a lot more. Because when we talk about defense industry, it is really a national prerogative and it is really linked to national security, even if, of course, there are a lot of differences when it comes to how a Swedish company will work and how a French company works out. This money is helpful in covering administrative costs, for example. That means just paying the staff, paying the fact that you have to maybe translate document into several languages because you talk to other countries, the train tickets, for liaison officers to move between countries. So that has been helpful, we've seen so far. And this is what the Commission is saying, is that it can be helpful even further in the coming years in supporting member states doing joint procurement, for example, or the industry cooperating on production, like let's say, oh, you do that part of the bullet, I do that other part of the bullet, and I do the powder. And doing that together, that could help breaking down some bottlenecks or smoothen the flow of the supply chain.
Mm-hmm. And so when we think of this 500 billion, so just to recap, The European Defense Industry Strategy allocates 1.5 billion between 2025 and 2027. That's too modest. Von der Leyen says 500 billion in the next decade. Where will the money go? Is it to strengthen cooperation mainly? Is it to increase capacity? Is it investment for the future? What are the priorities of this of the next mandate?
So the EU funds, when it comes to defense and when they are under the helm of the Commission, can only go for the strengthening of the competitiveness of the industry, of the single market. What that means is that it has to have a basis that is in we want to develop the industry and we want to do it together, because that's the point of the EU, isn't it? Is to do things together. So the money can go, like I said, in covering administrative costs, for example, in helping the industries actually talk together. It can go into helping setting up new production lines. It is maybe in cohesion funds as well to help maybe upskill people. It's a lot of very different options that exist that haven't maybe been studied or put into place yet, because so far it's been really into how does the EU support joint procurement? How does the EU support production? How does the EU support research and development? But there are many, many ways that defense industries impact society, or that society is impacted by defense industries. And obviously that can be supported by EU funds.
And of course, these EU funds are meant to incentivize European purchases in Europe. However, because currently most of our imports come from the United States, doesn't this policy risk further deteriorating transatlantic relations at a time where the U.S. positioning towards Europe might change after the November elections?
So that is a very good question. Obviously, the EU funds can only go so far, or at least mostly go into European industries. Now, the definition of what a European industry is something that is still under discussion. It's a very, very sensitive debate. The reason why it's sensitive is because a lot of the member states, like you're talking about, have very good relationships when it comes to defense and in their procurement with other countries like the US. What this means is that obviously the US has been very clear that whether it's under Trump or other presidents, that they want the Europeans to take charge of their own defense, but they also want them to buy American.
That's exactly what Loiseau remarked as well.
I know that many around Donald Trump consider us more as customers than allies. Let's talk about reciprocity. How easy is it for a European defense company to participate in procurement of military equipment in the United States? It's almost not feasible. If we are strong allies, let us respect each other.
So it will definitely impact the relationship a little bit. So far, we've seen that the American companies under the American Chamber of Commerce here in Brussels have said that there is a risk in excluding totally the US from any sort of planning or any sort of perspective in ramping up production. And that is also partly right, because you can't fill the gaps overnight. If you need 10 pieces of ammunition, let's say, tomorrow, but so far you can only produce one a day, it's going to be very difficult overnight to actually make 10, just because you don't have the factories, you don't have the supply chain, you don't have the powder. That means you don't have the explosives, you don't have every single material that is needed to create the shell of the ammunition and the bullet.
Yes, especially when we talk about ammunition, because according to a study done by Bruegel, this year we're still short on ammunition. We're not meeting EU requirements when it comes to capacity. So this slogan of investing in building European infrastructure, could it be too long-sighted as we're experiencing big pressure from Putin?
Yeah, you're very right. And Bruegel writes it very correctly, which is that indeed there is not enough being produced in Europe at the moment. What the European Commission is proposing with its program is to make sure that in the longer term, without actually giving any sort of a timeline, Europe can actually do that itself. And if there were to be another war, let's say, in like 10 years, can the Europeans handle it by themselves, or do they have to heavily rely on the Americans? Maybe the Americans at this time would be involved in Taiwan. We don't know what's going to happen. So yes, it is short-sighted, but you'll have a lot of arguments saying, yes, but you need to start investing now for the longer term perspective. When you buy an ammunition, it's fine. You can make it quite fast. But if you want to scale up the production of maybe bigger drones or planes or tanks or something like a bigger piece of equipment, which is not consumable, like a missile or a piece of ammunition, basically, that does take longer. And if you want to be able to have that technology here in Europe, you need to do that research, you need to do that innovation and already start thinking, okay, in 50 years, what do I want to use? What do I need to have in my armed forces to make sure that I can, as X country, be involved on a theater of operation without necessarily the support of others? Or if we do it as Europeans, can we do it as Europeans or do we still need to rely on others? If you don't have all of these elements of basically just an army and an armed force, and if you don't have all of these in Europe, you have a lot of voices saying, well, you are dependent on others, and that is a risk to your own security because you're not independent in your choices.
Absolutely. Autonomy is something that the EU is really pushing for. However, accelerating this process towards it is really going to cost a lot of money. And we've seen how in the past the EDIS has had difficulties obtaining financing and funding. Where is the EU planning to get this money from?
That is also a very good question. So what's interesting is that the industry is saying, well, we can't really tell you how much it costs to set up a new factory or to set up this or that or that. This is why it's difficult to know how much defense or scaling up that defense costs. But they will also say, well, it's for the member states to plan what they want for their armed forces. So then we can decide, okay, how many factories do we need? How many supply chains do we need to scale up? What do we need? And us not knowing, or the European Commission not knowing how much there is to buy, how the member states want to buy, and how much the industry can actually scale up, that leads to member states saying, okay, well, whatever the price, fine, we'll figure it out. But then we need to actually find the money. And whether we talk about 1 billion or 10 billion or 100 or 500, it still is a good amount of money that member states are not used to taking from their own national contributions and putting into the EU budget. And especially when we talk about the EU budget being so small and having also to answer to other needs like health, like agriculture, like tech, it's massive. So there's been a few discussions or ideas floated around so far. We've talked a lot about joint borrowing. So we've talked also a lot about, using bonds. We've talked about using other mechanisms that make it easier to borrow on the markets, maybe not joint borrowing. There's been also discussions about using the investment bank in making sure that it can take the money that it already has earmarked for defense, which is 6 billion at the moment, and making sure that maybe they can put that money towards more products and more projects that they can at the moment. So there has been a long list of ideas. So far, none of them is concretely and very seriously being considered. And that is because so many member states say, well, we don't know how much money we need. So it's a little bit of a cat biting its own tail, like we say in French.
A vicious cycle.
It's a vicious cycle of everyone putting the blame on each other. That said, the number of reference at the moment is the 500 billion put forward by von der Leyen. Even if people say we don't know where the number comes from, it has come from a study. It has come from inside the Commission, so we can assume that this is the one that we're going up with. And this is the one also that's been mentioned by the future Commissioner for Defense. And that's the one that we'll be referring to so far.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to talk about this new figure of Defense Commissioner. We now have a commissioner nominee, Andrius Kubilius from Lithuania. Now, we know, for instance, that some member states haven't even reached the 2% threshold when it comes to their defense spending. And we know, for instance, that in Cold War times, that went up to 3.5%. So if we need to get the money somewhere and the other options fail, we'll definitely have to push member states to invest more. Is this going to be the role of the defense commissioner? And do you think Kubilius is fit? What are the rumors about him?
So far, everyone I've talked to has been positive about the figure of Andrius Kubilius. the questions they're asking themselves is also a question that you just asked, which is also, what can he do? His main role will be leading negotiations on really the regulation that is the defense strategy and that is defense program. So budget will obviously be a big part of it, but there's only so much he can do in pushing member states to spend more. And when we talk about 2% as a target, which is a NATO target, it does apply to basically all of the EU member states except the neutrals. That is Malta, Cyprus, Ireland, and Austria. And obviously, it's the first call. It's before we talk about any sort of borrowing or any sort of whatever way we can find to find money is take it from your own coffins and do invest more. Usually, however, when people invest more in defense, they tax their people or they issue bonds themselves, national bonds. That's so far how it's been. Whether there will be a change in doing that together is going to be a big question. But Kubilius in himself cannot force people and cannot force governments to do so. It would have to be part of a much bigger and much wider discussion on the EU budget, what it will look like, what the priorities will be next to things like migration and agriculture and the green transition, you know? And defense is really high on the agenda right now. When the budget will be proposed maybe next year, it's a bit unclear how high defense will remain on the agenda and if it will warrant such a big increase of the budget in itself, or they will have to find alternative ways to get the money.
Thank you, Aurelie.
You're welcome.
I'm Giada Santana, and this was Euractivist Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractivist to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever it is that you get your podcasts. Leave us a star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite streaming platform. It will really help us spread the word about our work. This podcast was produced by Miriam Sánchez Tejada, Charles Cohen, and I. See you tomorrow. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.